has been the US's friend for years. More than friends, Europe has been under the USA's dominance. It only took the decisions the US permitted it to take. But with more awareness, the people of Europe no longer want the US to control them. They are considering China a hope for their economic welfare. Europe wants to work with China, but singing any deal with China means taking China's side. Do you think the US would let this happen? If the US wants to stop Europe and China from getting into closer bonds, how will it stop them? Let's find out. Europe and China have always been working together at some level, and it can be said that China and Europe have a business and trade friendship. Europe needs to connect itself to multiple developed nations to make deals. And as China's importance in the global market increases, more nations want to work with China. Just like that, Europe's relationships with China are getting stronger. The friendships that are based on business and trade get more serious when a nation's worth increases. If China becomes more important to the world, more nations would want to work with it. And its old partners want to increase the volume of trade and business. But some nations are on the edge of conflict when it comes to choosing to become friends with China. All of the nations have to work together to make some progress. It is impossible to do things all alone. And it is even difficult to do things without becoming a friend of a nation that is everyone's friend. That is the case with China and Europe's friendship. China's increasing importance in the world motivates UPRO to strengthen their friendship. Europe wants to do many new projects that will change its economy forever. The locals also want the government to sign more deals with China. Many European companies have production factories as well as a huge market in China. Europe knows that getting closer to China will only mean financial strength, and it eagerly wants to work with China. But for Europe to be China's friend requires permission. You must be thinking, why does a group of nations need someone's permission to work with a country? It sounds absurd, but it is true. Europe needs the US's permission to work with China. And if the US does not approve it, Europe has to choose sides. It has to pick someone between China and the US. And before we talk about why Europe needs to pick a side, let's first discuss whose side will Europe pick and why. Before we continue further, tell us, are you loving the video? If yes, please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel for more videos about China's development, power, and influence on the world. Let's continue now. Europe and US have always been each other's support, but with time, their relationship has gotten weaker. We will talk about why their relationship is getting weak later in the video. Europe's relationship with China, on the other hand, is getting stronger. And to everyone's disbelief, Europe decided to pick China. There will be consequences of this decision, but right now, Europe can't ignore the benefits this decision will bring them. But why did Europe have to take sides? China is becoming the new world leader, and at some level, it is replacing the US. Both nations have very complex relationships, if not actual wars. Chip wars, space war, and tech war is always going on between China and the US. And to win these wars, China uses its technology and efforts as weapons, while the US uses sanctions. Sometimes the sanctions don't work, but the US tries its best. The US does not want China to make any progress because the more China makes any progress, the more the US loses its dominance. And for that reason, the US also stopped other nations from working with China. The US also started putting pressure on Europe to stop working with China. And for a very long time, Europe did what it was told to. The US has influence over Europe, and for that reason, it had to do everything that the US was telling. Some of the Europe companies stopped operating in China. But it brought Europe a lot of loss because China is a huge market for its companies. The sales of these companies in China were more than in any other nation. But due to the US pressure, the companies stopped operating in China. The problem started when Europe figured out that the US has not stopped its business with China. The US was stopping other nations from working with China, but it was working with China at the same rate. So only Europe was at a loss. Doing no business with China was also not possible for Europe. In the past, there have always been business bonds between China and Europe. China's friendship has always been a reason to generate more revenue, and now breaking all the bonds was not possible. So Europe decided to take action. When the US forced ASML to stop signing deals with China, Europe opposed the decision. The officials mentioned that they don't want to be a part of China and the US conflict, and they will continue working with China. They even accelerated the order's delivery to China to prove that they had not accepted the US's decision. But standing against the US isn't as simple as it might sound. If Europe decides to stand against the USA's decision, that means it is with China. And Europe doesn't hate the idea of being on China's side. The US has always been very dominating in Europe. Most of its decisions were taken by the US. Not only is the US too involved in politics, but it also tries to control the nations. Not a single independent nation would want the US to control them. There can be some point where two nations can't agree, but the US tries to force all its decisions. At this time, all nations know that China is becoming more and more important than the US. And for that reason, all nations want to work with China. And every nation should have the freedom to choose which country it wants to do business with. Later or sooner, Europe had to push the US back and take control. And this is the time when Europe is doing it. But what benefit will Europe get if it chooses China over the US? China has a huge market for European companies. The sales of these companies are increasing day by day. In China, there is a huge demand for all the tech devices. With more development, the demand for tech-related devices increases. For huge companies, working with China brings them a lot of benefits. The production cost in China is also very low. And for that reason, all the nations want to have production factories in China. And not just that, there are many other projects on which China and Europe can work. After the Russia-Ukraine conflict, Europe has been under an energy crisis. It requires more energy-generating resources, and only China can help Europe with that. China makes energy from renewable energy sources at a lower price. It also sells solar panels at a cheap price. And for all the nations facing the energy crisis, solar panels are the best way to deal with it. It will make them self-reliant. The world will also become a better place if huge energy consumers start to use solar energy. All nations want to achieve zero carbon emission goals, and that would only be possible without China's aid. According to many experts, China will become Europe's best friend if they work on green energy together. Both will together accelerate the green transition. China will be promoting its solar panels, while Europe will be able to fight against the energy crisis. But there are some concerns about China's and Europe's friendship. China is Russia's best friend, and Russia's and Europe's relations are not so good. People think that it will affect China and Europe's friendship. But that is not the case. China never mixes its conflicts and its business. It can maintain a friendship with both nations without being unfair to any. The only problem will only be the US. The US might try to force Europe, but the people of Europe are tired of the US